I'll start by paying respects to Garma and my admiration of the Othyu Yindi Foundation. I think in the course of a year one gets burnt out, run down, and then you come here and you get revitalised again. And this has got to be the foremost gathering in the world, I think, of people across races that are dealing in depth with subjects that the rest of Australia know little about and let alone want to grapple with. And it rekindles my belief in mankind, humankind. And I think people of Fred Chaney's age should be on a veranda with a blanket over their knees. But it's events like this, I think, that rekindle the fire in him, rekindles the fire in me, and brings me here. Fred probably nailed it 5 minutes ago. He said the last thing people want to hear at this stage of the game on a Sunday afternoon is this subject. But nevertheless, here we are. And this is part 3 of an ongoing discussion of this kind in this forum. In previous years, there's been a discussion about whether or not the money, the Grants Commission process at the federal level in GST sharing between the jurisdictions are spent wisely by the Northern Territory Government. But before we move to that, I want people to fix on those numbers there if you can see them from the rear of the room. But if you can't, I'll read a couple out. In particular, the Western Australian numbers and the Northern Territory numbers. Western Australia last year got 30 cents in the dollar of GST collection. 30 cents per capita. This year is 34 cents. And they're squealing. They've squealed year after year after year. And I'm afraid Fred Chaney's going to take the Western Australian position on this. The Northern Territory last year got $5.28 per capita. And this year it's dropped to $4.60 odd. If you go through those numbers carefully, there's all sorts of conclusions you can draw. The first is that only New South Wales and the Northern Territory lost money. Everybody else gained. In percentage terms, the Northern Territory lost about, on one calculation I did, 22% more than the share of money lost by New South Wales. The difference between those figures is a consequence of what's called horizontal fiscal equalisation. Economists dreamt up that term. And I come across something the other week that said, what leads people to become economists? And the answer was they lack the charisma to be undertakers. But nevertheless, the intent behind those figures is to give each jurisdiction, allegedly, an equal capacity to deliver an average level of services to their jurisdiction. Our loading comes about as a consequence of a massive land mass with extreme climatic conditions from the most severe deserts in the centre to the tropical coast, and an enormous Indigenous mix in that population. Our Indigenous mix is in the order of now, I think, 32 or 33%. And if you go to primary school age, it's more like 40%. And there's a loading in that funding to address the Indigenous disadvantage factor. What there isn't in that loading is a factor to address the inherited infrastructure deficit that the Commonwealth handed to the Northern Territory government at the time of self-government in 1978. And people expect somehow that the Northern Territory government, when it's simply given funds to address an average level of services, is going to be able to use that money to address the backlog that it inherited. It simply can't. On the question of the adequacy of that money, and I'll probably get in reverse sequence now to these overhead projections, it strikes me that there's a few things operating to the Territory's disadvantage, and we discussed these briefly last year. The first is, people are shocked when I point out that the Territory has a declining share of the national Indigenous population, a declining share. I was horrified when I first learned that. How can that possibly be? And last year I blamed in part the Bureau of Statistics. And there was an officer from the Bureau in the audience, and he got an attack of the vapours when I mentioned that. And he reckoned it was entirely inaccurate. But when you're left with self-identification, and you see stories like in the Australian Weekend magazine a few years ago of a bloke in a possum skin coat sitting on Mount Ainslie that had learnt a fortnight before that he had Indigenous ancestry, and now he's zealously claiming Aboriginal ancestry, then he and all people like him then detract from the share of the money that the Territory is going to get. And then I read in newspapers too about a serious blue in Dubbo where a person had identified as Aboriginal, had been employed as a CEO at an Aboriginal organisation for years, until somebody said, that claim is false. And it was proven that it was false. The other thing that strikes me, and I've been in this game a long, long time, and I'm not casting aspersions on people, I'm not looking for a fight, but the Tasmanian population in 1971 was like 500, 1976, 1,500, 71, 81, 3,600, and now it's about 18,000. And you can find those numbers in New South Wales and Victoria and other states too. These are the exponential growth in Indigenous numbers in the states that can't be explained by natural population increase, can only be explained by people doing serious genealogy work and finding out that they had an ancestor 200 years ago that was Aboriginal. So now the family's identifying as Aboriginal and drawing money away from the Northern Territory. So there's some...
And other disadvantaged areas.
Oh, and excellent interjection, Marcia. I do no less than compliment you. I wouldn't be game to do otherwise. No. I want to turn for a moment to, and we can flick over, I think. Move on. This is an argument that Barry and I began 2 years ago. People tell me that he won, but I'm going to maintain that I did. It's the argument as to whether or not that extra loading that the Territory gets, $5.30, $4.60, has all got to be spent in the bush. And the Northern Territory government would maintain that if 80% of correctional services is occupied by Indigenous people, then 80% of the total cost of running that department is attributable to that loading for Indigenous that's inherent in the GST share. And I think that's where I come out on the argument. And it's not a question of whether it's a CLP government in place or an ALP government in place. The people that are making the budgetary decisions in government inescapably must fund that prison population, must fund the police, must fund hospitals. That's not discretionary expenditure. That's almost impressed expenditure. Whatever the costs arising from that expenditure are, governments must meet it. But that's enough on the arguments of the past. I want to move immediately to the present. And what we've got in front of us now is something that I don't think jurisdictions have paid enough attention to, and I'm talking about the Treasurer's referral to the Productivity Commission, a reference to review the Commonwealth Grants Commission. Most peculiar set of circumstances. The Productivity Commission is reviewing the Commonwealth Grants Commission over its methodology in cutting up the national pool of GST money between the states. The only reason that referral has been given is because of the agitations of Western Australia. No other jurisdiction wants it because they can see the problems. It included in a paper that I've passed to Sean, and I'm not going to risk Marcia's wrath by reading. Okay. No, there's 3 newspaper articles that are quite long, which I will skip over, which address squarely what the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, has said. Now, but I will turn to some of the terms of reference to bear my point out. First of all, I've got to say that because of the agitations of Western Australia, the Commonwealth has given it $260 million extra to compensate for this perceived shortfall through the Commonwealth Grants Commission equalisation process, which hitherto had been considered the best such equalisation process anywhere in the world, with the result that the Commonwealth Grants Commission people were in great demand elsewhere in the world to assist them with coming up with similar processes. But I recall in my days as Northern Territory Grants Commission Chairman, annoyance that South Australia had got about $100 million extra out of the Commonwealth through being noisy too, for roads programs. So there is a way outside the process by appeal straight to government, and I don't think the Northern Territory government, whether it's the CLP or the ALP, has been noisy enough. I think the evidence is there that you can get extra money if you try hard enough. But in WA's case, most people are saying that they're in serious budgetary problems now because they used the windfall of iron ore royalties to add to their recurrent budget rather than spending it on one-off infrastructure. They never had an eye to when there'd be a downturn in iron ore royalties. And they're caught. Terms of reference of this Productivity Commission review as provided by the Treasurer. Back one. Here's the rub. State, well, this is one. This will do. State laws and policies restricting the development of energy resources. Fracking in the Northern Territory. I'll come back to that. Whether the present horizontal fiscal equalisation formula may have the effect of producing a disincentive for a state to develop a potential industry or raise a royalty rate for an existing industry at an appropriate time. In other words, inherent in that is a suggestion that Western Australia is penalised because they've raised the iron ore royalty receipt rate. And the final one is whether the CGC, Commonwealth Grants Commission, HFE, you're up with the jargon by now, I hope, of a rolling 3-year average provides a disincentive. And what they're saying there is there's a double-edged sword involved, that the Commonwealth Grants Commission adopts an approach of averaging the last 3 years. So if there's a sudden downturn, you're cushioned a little bit. Or if there's a sudden upturn, you're cushioned a bit too, you know, so you can work the rest of that out for yourself. Now, I want to turn now to the lessons that we can draw, or the warnings that we can draw from those terms of reference. And I want to illustrate the point by recounting a conversation I had with a then minister probably 10 years ago, and he was resident in Wargate. You can probably work out who it is, those of you that are in-house. He was resident in Wargate, across the harbour from Darwin, a tiny community government council. And that community government council rate level was about half the average rate level around the Northern Territory. And this minister obviously did not understand the basics of the Northern Territory Local Government Grants Commission processes, because he said, God, you've been a bit hard on Wargate, you better top us up. And I said, Minister, we don't reward under effort. If you choose to rate at half the territory average, then that won't result in an extra share of funds from the Local Government Grants Commission. But on the other side of that, communities, government councils have said to me, look, we do 3 garbage runs a year, and you ought to compensate us for that additional effort on garbage runs. And my response is no. We're on about effort neutrality, a level playing field. And I think Scott Morrison is on about the same thing in these terms of reference. We can go over another one. The first term of reference, I'll just refresh you, state laws or policies restricting development. He's clearly saying that the Commonwealth Grants Commission process should not compensate those states who forego revenue. And he was much, much clearer in one of the media stories that I've chosen to skip over in the interest of brevity, where he directly targeted the Northern Territory government's decision to ban fracking pending this inquiry. He sees it as a black and white situation. Australia's short on gas because they've agreed to export a lot of it without having enough brains to reserve some for the domestic market. He sees the massive reserves in the Northern Territory that are already proven as addressing that situation and also providing a royalty flow to the Northern Territory government. He sees the Grants Commission process of penalising WA for over-effort and compensating the Northern Territory for under-effort as a very, very ominous sign for the Northern Territory. And I might add that this subject of interstate distribution of GST is a taboo subject in the Australian Local Government Association, the national body of each state representative body. The national body has absolutely black banned the inclusion of any agenda item that goes to this interstate distribution, because they know that they'll have an uncontrollable blue on their hands. They're dominated by the big states. You can only get more money for WA or the Northern Territory or South Australia from the bigger states. The bigger states have got the numbers on that national body. Taboo subject. And I've got a sideline up there. Make no mistake, this is a dramatic turn of events. And to add a bit of insult to injury, the Territory Government never made the initial deadline for the lodgement of submissions to the Productivity Commission review. And the Northern Territory News, that investigative masterpiece, absolutely slammed the Northern Territory Government, and their response was, but the Tasmanian Government sought an extension of time, but Tasmania had actually lodged the submission on time, but they sought an extension of time on behalf of everybody, and they've now put their submission in. So I don't think that's endeared the Territory to the Treasurer. But I've had another thought there, that if Morrison is going to be holier than thou in addressing states' efforts on revenue collection, then I think the states ought to turn that back on him and get him to address some of the insane expenditure activities that the Commonwealth has been involved with in recent times. And, you know, I've got in mind things like the school libraries. I've got in mind the absolute rorting of the tertiary education scheme, tens of billions of dollars. You know, I've mentioned up there the 4,000 approvals, it's not a misprint, of the Roy Hill mine, 4,000 approvals. We get every new government talking about a reduction of red tape, and then they add to their body of legislation willy-nilly while in office. Well, they've got to be held to account. I don't know what to say to the Territory Government to alert them to this. I think they're missing the boat, the point. Maybe something might come out of this. But it seems to me that Scott Morrison is singularly unambiguous when he talks about extra effort being penalised, WA, under effort being rewarded, the Territory. And I think it's only a matter of time until Scott Morrison extends that thinking to looking across the board at what revenue opportunities are there in each jurisdiction that haven't yet been taken up. What area of arable land is there that hasn't yet been taken up? I think it's inevitable that sooner rather than later they've got to get onto the question of Aboriginal land and why isn't it in production? And therein lies some curlies. Now, having bored you to death with the work of economists, I want to turn finally to a story that I read right in the middle that I was thinking of this paper. And it grounds us again. And some of you might have read it in your interstate newspapers. We were certainly full of it here in the Territory. And it involved an old lady in an outstation northeast of Alice Springs, 87 I think. She didn't have a house. She lived outside with dirty blankets and dogs. And this was in the middle of an area that's primarily administered by the Barkly Regional Council, which is a predominantly Indigenous local government body. She lives in the area of the Europuncher Health Service, which is an independent Aboriginal medical service. At the main population centre, there's a respite centre at Alpera. But to me, this woman was born there. She's chosen to live there. Her aged husband is a carer. I think she's sometimes visited by her granddaughter. She's visited by a community-controlled health services nurse. She's got the opportunity to go to a community-controlled aged person respite centre. And it begs the question, in my mind, and I want to confront you all with this question, is where does the responsibility of family come in here? Where does the responsibility of community come in? Why is it always defaulted to government? Which government would you blame? The local government? The territory government? Or the Commonwealth government, which has got responsibility for aged care? To what extent must governments continue to be expected to be able to deliver every minutiae of a service to ever smaller populations further and further out from service centres? Thank you.